So up next is a good friend of mine, Jeremy Feinberg. And he's not going to croak on this one. You're going to talk about leopard frogs and other herpetofauna. I had to throw that one in there. This is Francis. That's your pleasure. Go down. Down, but okay. Good to know. Good to know.
Hi, folks. I am thrilled to be here. Tim is largely the reason I came up. I grew up on Long Island and started my career working on Long Island for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at Brookhaven National Lab for about 3 years. And I worked closely with Tim, and it was an experience at the time I knew was really great. And I would have professors from my master's thesis come out to Brookhaven and tell me that they were jealous of what I was doing there. And I knew they were serious, but it took another 20 years or so to look back and realize how true it was. It was definitely by far the best professional experience. And so when I found out Tim was retiring, I actually reached out to Mike Bettini, who I want to thank for inviting me. And I said, hey, Mike, let's keep this a secret. I'm going to come and surprise Tim and be here. And Mike said, do you want to give a talk while you're at it? And I said, I don't know. I have a lot going on. I'm in DC. I have the kids and stuff. It might be kind of hard to pull this off. Let me think about it. I'd like to, but let me think about it. 2 weeks later or so, Tim Green sends me an email. What's the title of your talk going to be? So surprise. Here I am. In any case, on with the show. So I put this slide here because I just want to sort of say, like, you know, there's a saying, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? And it got me thinking, similarly, if a species goes extinct from Long Island and nobody notices, or only a few people care, does it even matter? And as we go through the talk, you'll see some of why I think about that. I've also never talked under such a big screen that I have to look straight up for, so forgive me if I keep turning around. This is a very visual talk, and I like to point at my slides and look at some of the photos as I explain them. So this that you see here is the Atlantic coast leopard frog, Rana or Lithobates kauffeldi. Take your pick. I have no preference. It is a species that's inextricably linked to Long Island. Long Island is key in its recent discovery only about a little over a decade ago as a new species that was previously undetected. And it also, unfortunately, is, as much as it's linked to Long Island, it also has sort of a tragic linkage or a sad linkage that you'll see as we go through the presentation. These are, as far as I know, the only 4 photographs of this species here on Long Island. And these are historical at this point because the species doesn't occur here anymore. But these are powerful and valuable photos. There are quite a few museum specimens. So there are physical frogs that we could still go and see at some of the big museums, particularly the American Museum of Natural History. And I think there are a few from Long Island at the Smithsonian, which I should know if there are or not, but I can't recall right now. In any case, these photos are neat. The ones on the top are certainly certainly older. They're over a century. And I look at those now, and for those of you who might know leopard frogs and leopard frog habitat, just the idea of those being on Fire Island today is unfathomable. Amazing to see those photos taken by Frank Overton. And the bottom 2 are more palpable because those are in our lifetime. Those were taken by folks who are still alive, and folks probably know these people. They are both from Montauk, the last place where these animals, the species, was seen, Oyster Pond. And with the last sighting being something probably around the year 2000. So I like to throw dots on a map, and I like to kind of visualize where things used to occur. And so this map is a composite of museum records, written documentation by authorities like Roy Latham, and all the talks today, by the way. The last time I was at the Long Island Natural History Conference was probably 10 or 15 years ago. And coming today, all I can say is the phrase leveled up. This is a really incredible day, and the talks before this have all kind of contributed to this. But it's neat to see how these talks build into this. But yeah, folks like Roy Latham, and you can see why records like that are priceless today, because you can go back and reconstruct the past of a species. Some of these also represent anecdotal reports, and over the years, I've definitely had my share of folks coming up to me and telling me where they saw their leopard frogs. And I know today that I go on iNaturalist, and I know experts still goof them up, not because they're bad scientists, but because these species are really hard to differentiate. And so I would assume that something like 80% of these dots are accurate, and probably a few of them might be anecdotes of something that was more of a pickerel frog than a leopard frog, but it shows you the distribution of the species. What's also convenient is that the extinction occurred from west to east. So thanks for going in a single direction as you disappeared, because you made a very easy graphic. So you can sort of see the front of extinction moves from west to east and sort of generally follows this timeline to the very last place where they hung on at Oyster Pond, again, around the year 2000. So this just sort of sets the stage for the backstory of the species. Now, if we go back to when I first met Tim and when I first arrived at BNL to do 3 years of work there, largely focused on reptiles and amphibians, we didn't know that there was a different species that was once on Long Island. And in fact, I was creating a life list like a lot of people do for birds. Us herpers do that as well. And Long Island didn't have a huge list to accomplish. And within a pretty short period of time, I knocked off a lot of species, particularly at BNL, because like Green Tree, it's a 5,000 plus acre facility that is not wide open to the public. And so few have access to it, or had. And when you do, you realize, oh my gosh, this is like a postage stamp of land stuck in time at a period that was not really reflective of the surrounding landscape, where the 7.2 million of us that live on Long Island, or did in my case, because I now have moved to the DC area, could have the potential to disrupt all the species and bisect the landscape with cars and houses and development. So it was a fantastic time. And I was going through and really inventorying the species there. And there was one that I kept coming up against and saying, I cannot find southern leopard frogs, which was the species that was regarded to be the Long Island native at the time. And it's still a recognized species that extends from central New Jersey southward to the Gulf Coast. But in any case, we were looking for the leopard frog and we couldn't find it. So after I wrapped up my time at BNL, this mystery and this challenge nagged me and wouldn't get out of my head. So when I started my PhD, it was focused on figuring out what had happened, because at that point we'd had 3 years and pretty widespread efforts to find the frog, and they'd failed. And I said, if nobody noticed and nobody cares, this thing's just going to disappear without any attention. And I said, I don't know, maybe I'm going to be the only one who cares, but I'm going to go and try to figure out what happened. And so what I did as the main thrust of my PhD work was to collect egg masses, and then I would bring them. These were collected, and I'll show a graphic of where the collection sites were. These were collected off island, obviously, because they were gone at this point. And I hope I'm wrong, by the way. If somebody ever proves me wrong that they're gone, I will be thrilled. I would love that. So I don't want to put a stake and be like, they absolutely are gone. And I hope that's the case, because I don't. So we would raise the larvae for a brief period in captivity, and then bring them out to select sites on Eastern Long Island that really had characteristics that were seemingly either ideal or suitable for leopard frogs. And we'd rear them in those enclosures that you see me standing next to. And we would see what happens and monitor their growth trajectories and survival trajectories. And given that it was Long Island is largely viewed as an extinction zone as far as I saw it, we expected to have survival outcomes that were typically not good. But it was neat. In some cases, we had survival outcomes that were surprising into full metamorphosis into young frogs. And so this generated some interesting results. And again, the objective here was just to understand what happened. So we had more than just a story of another species that is gone for inexplicable reasons. So initially, I was collecting true southern leopard frogs down in southern New Jersey in the Pinelands, and I ran 4 trials over 3 years of these enclosure growth experiments. Early on, I think it was even before, maybe in the middle of the first trial, we got word that there was somehow a surviving extant population of leopard frogs still on Staten Island, even though that was one of the places we also surveyed. And surveyed pretty thoroughly for southern leopard frog. But these folks were like, no, we found a few, they're there. And sure enough, we went back and redoubled our efforts and eventually did find them and said, oh, great, now we have a closer, more geographically relevant source and a genetically similar, presumably more similar source to bring eggs in and get larvae from. And out east is where we would do our trial experiments. So just to show where and how these experiments were done, there were 6 sites across eastern Long Island. And the color coding, I'm not going to get into the Phragmites part of the work here, but green were sites that had no Phragmites invasion. Yellow had mild Phragmites invasion, and the red sites were heavily invaded by Phragmites at that time to see if Phragmites were possibly playing a role. But you could see that there are, at each site, were 6 enclosures, and within each of those were 6 tadpoles. And again, we ran 4 trials over 3 years between 2007 and 2009 to see what happened and follow their trajectories. So it was interesting. I think the most interesting results that came out of this that I think do explain largely or maybe entirely what happened to this species are the disease results. And so the first one, for folks who are familiar with frogs and frog die-offs around the world, which happened sort of suddenly in the late 1990s and early aughts, was at 4 sites we had detections of BD, or Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, which is the chytrid fungus. That's the common name that a lot of people are aware of. But to just be BD positive, to find frogs that you can detect BD in, doesn't necessarily mean these frogs are doomed. A lot of times you'll get BD positives in frogs that do just fine. And that's what we actually see at the Staten Island site where we found these frogs, where we found the eggs back at the early start of the project. And at these 2 sites, in black, we were just with the black BD, we were just finding BD present. But these 2 red BDs indicate something very surprising and still to this day, I believe, unique east of the Mississippi. And that was the disease state of chytridiomycosis. And I had seen all the videos from the tropics of frogs, and typically there's a you find them dying in a certain way. They're twitching and they can't right themselves, and they're early stage frogs. And that's exactly what I was finding at those 2 sites when I would pull them out of the water to look and see how the recent metamorphs were faring. And so that was pretty stunning to find this worldwide deadly disease state right here at 2 of my field sites. But as if that wasn't enough, there's more. At one of the sites, we also had a ranavirus outbreak, another disease that if you're an amphibian, you would choose not to encounter. And it wiped out an entire trial very quickly. But wait, there's more. there's a third amphibian disease that if you're an amphibian, you don't want to encounter, and that's perkinsea. This is at the time, it was a disease, a pathogen that was rising up and also poorly known and poorly studied. And this was, I believe, again, a first for New York for certain. I think it's more widespread and more detected now than it was at the time. But we could see a die-off of perkinsea at one of the sites where you have the red PO, standing for Perkinsus-like organism. So I've been talking to colleagues recently because we're still trying to do some work with these data, and they've been saying, "Oh, it's a triple-demic." So it's a new phrase that I'm taking into my integrating into my delivery. So we have the triple-demic that I think really explains a lot of what happened for this frog. So here's a neat map that shows the distribution of this new species. This is from Schlesinger et al., 2018, and it was an effort from, I think, 9, 12, 11, something like 10 or 11 states all contributed to figuring out where the new species was distributed. And the deep blue is where we now largely know the frog occurs and is extant, that, surviving, and where you could find live populations. And you see the light blue shading for Long Island says here we were, but we're gone now. And that extinction zone actually wraps right around the Bronx and Westchester and continues along the Connecticut coast right about to that. I think that's a question mark. So that's your extinction zone. And the frog is now poised in New York State to sadly join the endangered species list. People congratulate me like, no, that's not what I wanted, but I do think it's going to be helpful in keeping the few populations left. But we don't want to be congratulated for joining that list. It's a sad thing, but I do think at this point it's the best thing for the remaining populations in the state. And part of, I think the numbers spoke very strongly to DEC when they were reviewing this, and I was bringing it up along with some colleagues, like this species deserves listing. What you can see is a species that a little over 100 years ago was present in at least 10, if not 11 New York counties. And if you fast forward 100 years, you can see a pretty precipitous decline where now we only find the species in 3 of those 11 counties. So certainly a stunning decline in terms of county distribution. These are just photos of the habitat where you would find them. And first glance, you probably think, oh yeah, there's plenty of this on Long Island. So they could and should still be here. But again, it's that disease issue that is a big one. But a lot of these habitats, I really became hard pressed to find ideal habitats, even compared to Staten Island. For example, down here, I'm sure that those 1911 photographs in black and white were habitats like this along the coast, but they don't really exist in this area anymore. It's sort of a wet ephemeral meadow. Sadly, this is where we discovered the species, by the way. Sadly, there are 4 Amazon warehouses on top of this wetland now. Each of the buildings is the size of 17 football fields. So just the magnitude of the loss of the site where we discovered the species is also a stunning add-on to the story. They also are quite abundant in places like the Meadowlands, deep in heavy Phragmites invaded still pools. And you can't really differentiate, but this is a riparian floodplain corridor. And they're also quite common in those sort of habitats where they occur. So zooming out now, since I had the opportunity to come up here and talk, and I've been tracking, particularly through iNaturalist, the trajectory of all the other species I was very interested in over these years and now decades. Just to give a little bit of an update on other species of herps, reptiles and amphibians, and their status. I'm sorry for all the information. I tried to put in some pictures to mitigate against all the different species that are here, so it's not just a word and meme soup. But there are some species, some of which we would expect, things like bullfrogs, snapping turtles that are very widespread and seem to be doing just fine, if not better than they might have done in earlier conditions. But then we see some that are encouraging, like, this is all based on if you do a search for iNaturalist and look at the actual numbers of observations, which is not a perfect method, I understand, but it was one that allowed me to just kind of think about how I would categorize these species. So something like a box turtle, when I was young, people were predicting their absolute demise on Long Island. But they're one of the top observed species on iNaturalist, and I wouldn't say that they're perfect, but they still seem to be doing pretty well on Long Island, and a bunch of other species. But what I really wanted to focus on are the rare species here and the variable. The rare species, I had two criteria in my mind. These are species that have either seen very dramatic declines across Long Island over the past decades or century, or where they only occur in very sparse numbers. So I believe all five of those species that I have listed there fall into either one or other category, or perhaps both. And so for folks who are just thinking about other species that might be on a bad trend, given the story of the leopard frog, these are the ones I would focus on. So one of the species, or two of the species I was looking at, eastern hognose snake, I was really having a hard time teasing that apart from the variable category. I was thinking about the blue-spotted salamander. That's a species that is really quite restricted to the areas around Montauk, and maybe had some earlier distributions in Calverton based on Sherman Bishop's salamanders of New York from like I think 1938. But the declines of the hognose snake are much different than what you see in the blue-spotted salamander, which largely seems to be a very small location but fairly stable. And then so I'll just let you all digest. I'm not going to read these species by species, but the oddities are sort of a category I really like, and it includes one of the ones from earlier, the northern dusky salamander, just because, as one who accidentally stumbled on a new species, I appreciate that there are surprises that we need to accept, but I also have a fair amount of skepticism, and I wonder how something went undetected in such a high population area. I mean, it's a great story. I just think some of these stories are hard to answer. And so this is a recent discovery, and also the internet is creating some really interesting things. There was a posting of a northern slimy salamander around the same time of the northern dusky. These are two species that are not really thought of as, well, certainly not known to occur. The dusky had some old museum records. So, we're left to sort of make heads and tails of this. Well, anybody could post anything on iNaturalist, but you want to think like maybe there are species and outposts that we've just missed. I don't have any great answers, but it's a fascinating category, these sort of oddities. Northern leopard frogs, there are quite a few museum samples. I've seen them, held them, photographed them when we were figuring things out with the leopard frogs from Queens, northern leopard frogs. Nobody regards them as part of the known herpetofauna of Long Island, but they're worth noting in this category. And for some reason, wood turtle pops up every so often. I don't think anybody would ever say wood turtles are native to Long Island, but they've been popping up since the 60s in documents and records, and who knows? But in any case, hopefully this is an enjoyable sort of breakdown of the different categories of species. But I want to end with a sort of sobering last slide, and this is looking at those species, herps and beyond, that we've lost from Long Island. And I don't know what the normal or natural background rate of extinction would be on Long Island if people weren't getting involved, but I do think it would be less than the suite of species we see here. And I didn't even get in, I kept it to, in our lifetimes, some of our lifetimes, our grandparents and then great-grandparents. So I'm not going back to when wolves and mountain lions vanished. I wanted to keep it rooted in something more tangible. But you can still see quite a long list of species and probably growing. Some of these are question marks. Mink, gray fox. Tim and I got to see a gray fox in our lifetime. So, and I know that there are occasional records. So I don't feel confident that they're gone, but they might be close. John Turner pointed out, Eskimo curlew, another bird could be added. So you know, it's an interesting list and it's one to ponder. I don't know if we looked at these numbers and sort of projected them to the total fauna for Long Island and then sort of did a comparable analysis for the mainland of the United States, what this number, what a ratio would be and what this would be equivalent to across the US. We've lost what, let's say these are 12, 13 species. Would this equal losing something like 100 species across the US if you did it nationally? And our eyes would pop out of our head. So again, if something disappears and we don't know or we don't care, does it matter? I'll leave you all to ponder that. And if I have any time for questions, I am happy to take them. I didn't get everything on there. Yeah. Sorry, did you ask, did they disappear because of habitat? Are you, let's see if I can get this back. Are you talking about sorry.
Yeah. How many reasons do you think they disappeared?
Speaking about the leopard frogs in particular, or
Leopard frog.
well, each one has a different story. So in the case of the leopard frog, it appears to be disease seems to be part of the story, for sure. But for example, timber rattlesnakes, again, back to 1915, they were basking on the Long Island Railroad tracks as an adjusted behavior to human infrastructure. It warmed them up. And yes, and there were bounties. You can go back and read these old articles from Long Island where they would talk about the bounties and the number killed and how fantastic that year's take was and what an accomplishment it was, along with bald eagles, how they were considered, you know, vermin because they would steal fish from the fishermen. So this stuff, if you go to some of the libraries, they still have the old postings. They're fascinating to read. You're welcome.
The Staten Island site had any of those diseases present?
We didn't do the full treatment where the necropsies were going, you know, where we were sending animals off for necropsies. We did send a few. This was back, they would go to USGS and they did these necropsies. So Staten Island, we didn't have a large sample, but of about 10 or 12 animals that we sampled, they were about 40% BD positive. But that population is persisting. It's still there today. So those warehouses didn't decimate the entire population, but what it did is it pushed them from the optimal habitats into the little fringes that are around the warehouses. And that's all that's left now. I heard them yesterday, so I can vouch that as of yesterday, they were still there. Yeah.
Haven't mentioned anything about toads.
Sure.
Now,
Yeah.
I have one question because we have quite a large number of toads at our park, a local in Huntington. And I've come to the conclusion that they eat ticks.
I do not know that. It's interesting. And now you have me wondering if I look it up in the literature. I've never seen that, but that's something that I wouldn't think of it as a tick control method, but I also wouldn't rule it out because I don't rule anything out.
We have a lot of ponds, property, and I noticed that when the toads are gone for one reason or other, like last summer during the heat wave, the ticks just exploded.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Jeremy, thank you.
Thanks.
Excellent talk. And,
Thanks.
I had a question. You know, you had 3 rare diseases affecting those frogs.
Not rare, just virulent, and they were emerging diseases at the time. This was done again 2007 to 2009.
It's suppressing their immune system. That the fact
Oh.
that they are susceptible to these
It certainly could be. There could be there are different strains of chytrid fungus. So those two disease state sites could have a totally different strain of chytrid. Because again, we're finding chytrid in the population on Staten Island, and that has a lot more contaminants than Oyster Pond.
So the fact that it's other frogs have the same fungus, but yet these frogs are suffering. It seems like there's a resistance.
Yeah.
That something's stressing them. You know, out west, iron particles are seriously affecting salmon. Do you think there could be any correlation with the tires or the contaminants in tires?
I mean, we also looked at contaminants, and that's a lot harder to tease out in a project like this. The diseases were the easier thing to analyze, but we certainly don't rule out contaminants as potentially having a role in there as well. It's just weird that Staten Island would have all of its contaminants, and Oyster Pond, where they disappeared from, presumably has less contaminants.
Yeah.
So we don't know, but I think we can chat more after. Thanks, everyone.